Right, just about there.
It's under.
Let me help you get the mute. There we go. All right, I think we are just about there. Just need to make sure that YouTube has connected. All right, I think that is working. We'll give it just one more minute or give or take for people to log in, and then we will carry on because we only got through one Mishnah last week, which I thought was wonderful because I think we had a very exciting and interesting discussion. So hopefully we got a lot of the basic concepts out. Anybody who's watching this week and wasn't here last week, go back and watch it on YouTube because we covered a lot of ground about some of the fundamental ideas of Rabbinic Judaism, the construction of traditions, and some of the differences between what the rabbis instituted and what we are currently practicing. And like I said last week, what the rabbis instituted and what we practice currently today may feel a little different, especially when we get to Mishnah 2 here, but recognize the rabbis are trying to create a baseline, and what we do is far in excess for what the rabbis discussed. That's okay. There are many aspects of Judaism where we do above and beyond the call of duty. Most famously for Hanukkah, where you technically only need to light one candle each night, but we do more because we can and we wish to. That's fine. Recognize when you are doing more, when you are doing it because it is tradition and an important part of your connection to the community as it exists today, but also recognize when that is different than the rabbinic style, because that shows you how our life continues to evolve, change, and be blessed by the constant shaping of Judaism by each generation. All right, with that as enough of an introduction, let's go ahead and jump into Mishnah 2 from chapter 1. And again, we are continuing with the theme of Yadayim, the washing of one's hands before eating from bread as a form of ritual purification. The fact that it's a form of ritual purification we covered in much more detail last week, and I'll refer you to that video if you have not already watched it. Water may be poured over the hands out of any kind of vessel. So to do Netilat Yadayim, we've just learned that you have to use a vessel. You cannot just push your hands into a bucket. You cannot just put your hands into a river. There needs to be pouring, and the water needs to be coming from a vessel. This is why in the modern form of Netilat Yadayim, you'll see people having a dedicated cup. Again, you'll notice here, it doesn't have to be a dedicated cup, but that is the type that we now use, at least in most circumstances. I know in a pinch, I've used other types of cups, but theoretically, it could be from anything that counts as a vessel. And that's going to be important for the next little bit. Even out of vessels made of animal dung, out of vessels made of stone, or out of vessels made of clay. Now, kelim, which is the Hebrew word for utensils or vessels, is a whole nother masechet, as Dr. Kulp points out. And in that discussion about vessels, there is a debate about whether something made from animal dung or made out of stone or made out of clay counts as enough of a vessel, because those vessels are not susceptible to ritual impurity. And here what our Yadayim Mishnah is telling us is that even though you might think that these types of vessels don't count as real vessels, for the purposes of Netilat Yadayim, they definitely do. I should hope that all of you understand that making a cup out of dung, the droppings of an animal, may be physically possible, and it may be technically legal for doing Netilat Yadayim, but that doesn't mean you should do it. This is not the kind of cup that should be used. The rabbis are simply making a point that the level of vesselhood is quite low for doing netilat yadayim. Again, this is following on from the pattern we discussed last week, that as this is a ritual instituted by the rabbis have a great deal of latitude for creating leniencies within it. That it's their baby, and they can dress it how they want. Also, I hope you'll understand that the fact that they recognize that it could be a vessel made out of animal dung goes to show that while this definitely had, in general, health benefits for washing hands before eating, health was not the primary care or consideration. And no, they didn't have any sort of special wisdom of germ theory, or else they certainly wouldn't have allowed people to make things out of dung. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, Rabbi, for it to be a vessel, it has to be, it can't have any cracks or holes which the water can leak out, right?
Well, that's what we're going to get to in the rest of the Mishnah. So the rest of the definition of vessel is coming in the next few lines. But yes, it needs to be a purpose-built item. It has to be built to be a vessel, and it has to be one that is suitable for carrying the liquid. So let's go ahead and move on to the next little bit, because that will reinforce that concept. Water may not be poured, meaning if you poured from the following vessels, it doesn't count as being an official pouring for netilat yadayim. Obviously, you can physically pour, but such a pouring is not a valid pouring. Water may not be poured from the sides of broken vessels, or from the bottom of a ladle, or from the stopper of a jar. So all of these items either are no longer intact, like you're pouring it out of the side of something where there's a crack or a break or a hole, and that's not the correct way the vessel was designed, or they were not designed as vessels in and of themselves. And even though they have a curved area, that doesn't make it a vessel. Simply being able to hold water for a while or in a way does not create it a vessel. It had to actually be made to be a vessel. And that's why the bevel on the stopper of a jar, the cup of a ladle, or a broken vessel are not valid for this purpose. Yes, sir?
Does it have anything to do with like what we learned in purity, like where you something broken? I don't know if we're there yet, but like where they broke the oven, they said that no longer can contract impurity because it's no longer a vessel.
That does not seem to be the concern. It's more that its status as a vessel has been lost by the damage to the item, that it no longer would be serviceable as a vessel. Or, sorry, I just realized my light wasn't on. That's why we're getting a little bit of weird shade. Or that it wasn't made to be a vessel in the first place, like the ladle or the jar stopper. So it's not a question of impurity. It's a question of what counts as a vessel. It's, like nowadays, people will often ask the supposedly difficult question of, is a taco a sandwich? Or is a hot dog a sandwich? And it's supposed to be like, oh, wow, what a head scratcher. And it's like, you know what? Define sandwich, and then I'll tell you whether or not it counts. The rabbis here are defining vessel, and thus they are telling us that these don't count.
Right. No, I get that. But I mean, the question wasn't whether or not it was a question of purity. I thought the reason that the broken oven couldn't become impure is because it's not a vessel.
So the issue with the broken oven, the tanur shel achnai, is a different topic. There, it's if an object has come into contact with a sheretz, a creepy crawly, then it has to be broken and then repaired. And once repaired, then it will be considered ritually pure again. And the loophole that was trying to be exploited by this particular type of oven was to build it pre-broken in pieces and have sand in between the layers so that you can disassemble and reassemble rather than having to actually break it. Ultimately, that is not the accepted position. But that's a different issue, even though it's both talking about broken objects. The issue at hand is different.
Oh, because I thought the reason it was made that it was no longer impure was because it was no longer a vessel.
Right, but it then gets reconstructed into its oven shape.
Right. So I thought it's no longer impure because it's no longer a vessel. So then when it gets put back into a vessel, it's still pure because the impurity had left when it was no longer a vessel.
To the best of my understanding, that's not how it works.
All right. Sorry.
It's
Tangent.
okay. Also, with regards to our pouring, nor may one pour water over the hands of his fellow out of his cupped hands. Again, putting water in your own hands and using them as a cup for someone else is not allowed. We already knew that you couldn't just put your hands and cup the water out of a river, but also you can't cup the water and make your hands into the vessel and then dump them on someone else's. So you need to actually have a vessel. Next part, because one may not draw, nor sanctify, nor sprinkle the water of purification, nor pour water over the hands in a vessel. So now we are getting a more general rule. And the one we've been talking about here is pouring water over the hands. But for the other types of water rituals, these are the ones mostly being involved in the red heifer ritual, the para aduma. We are finding that the rule with regards to the water in general for these other vessels also has to be done with a vessel. So this is a consistent rule for any of the water rituals, that it needs to be done from a vessel. And as you can see, most of them are for the red heifer. Then the sprinkling is for the somebody who is recovering from tzara'at. Somebody who is being covered from tumat met, the impurity from being in contact with the dead. And then, of course, our last one is the netilat yadayim itself. And as long as we're talking about vessels, we bring an additional topic. This is not particular to the netilat yadayim topic, but it is carrying on with the mnemonic of vessel information. And only vessels closely covered with a lid protect. In this case, we're talking about the ritual impurity. The Torah says that if there is a vessel, a jar in a tent, and somebody dies, that if the jar is covered, then the contents of the jar do not become ritually impure from the body. If the contents are not covered, then they do. And here we are finding out the precision of that when it says covered, it has to actually be properly covered. The lid has to actually cover correctly, not just be plonked in some manner on the top or not even be made to fit it. So it needs to be properly covered. And likewise, and only vessels protect their contents from uncleanness inside earthenware vessels, meaning that it has to actually be a vessel that is a proper vessel when we are talking about when something is on the outside, in this case, a sheretz, the creepy crawlies, that is on the outside, that if it is a proper vessel, then indeed the contents will be protected. If it is not a proper vessel, then the contents will not be protected. But again, that was an aside just because we were talking about vesselhood, if that is a word. Mishnah 3 gets into the topic of the actual mayim, the actual water that is used for the ritual of netilat yadayim. Water which had become so unfit that it could not be drunk by a beast, if it was in a vessel, it is invalid. But if it was in the ground, it is valid. All right, so let's make sure we understand by unfit for an animal to drink from it. If there is water that your cow, your horse, your dog would not be willing to drink from it, then that water is not okay to be used for netilat yadayim. If you have a barrel that has gone bad, it has algae growing into it, and it's somehow befouled, then if your animal would go, I'm not drinking that, then you can't scoop from it and use it in your cup to do netilat yadayim. However, if the water is still in the ground, meaning it is still a puddle, it is still a pond, even if your dog or cow would not drink from that pond, you are still allowed to use it as a source of water for netilat yadayim. Again, we're not talking here about whether or not it's a good idea. If an animal won't drink it, I probably don't want to pour it on my hands. We're talking about the legality of it, of whether it is effective in the ritual that is taking place. And again, the ritual here is not about hygiene. It is not about sanitation. It is about creating this extra barrier before we go to eat. And the water that could be used would be sufficient for the ritual, even if it's not a great idea. And this is true, in general, that if we wanted to make a mikveh, the mikveh doesn't have to look good. And unfortunately, there are many mikvahot that are not great, but they are still a kosher mikveh, and the water from it is still kosher for netilat yadayim. Next part. If there fell into the water dye or gum or sulfate of copper and its color changed, it is invalid. So even though the water may be perfectly fine and safe, once it is no longer water, but now a dye or an ink or a coloring substance, then it no longer really counts as water. And as such, you cannot use it as part of your netilat yadayim ritual. So even if the water was fit to drink, even if it was perfectly sanitary, now that it no longer counts as water because it has been discolored, then it is no longer fit for the ritual. Again, hopefully this is really driving home the idea that we're not talking about sanitation here. We're not talking about the quality of the water. We're talking about its definition within the rigorous confines of just netilat yadayim. If a person did any work with it or soaked his bread in it, it is invalid. So using your water for some other purpose, Dr. Kolb uses the idea of using it as a weight for a balance, or dipping bread into it, indeed just dough in order to moisten it and use it, not necessarily for eating, but just getting it ready for other use. Once you have done that, you have now rendered it basically wastewater, working water rather than mayim chayim, living water, natural water, or in other ways, flowing water. And that means it is no longer usable for netilat yadayim. So this is why you will see that people will take the water and go straight from it being drawn to being used for netilat yadayim. Yes, Aaron?
So if it has to be living water, does it have to come from a specific source?
No. When I say living water, I meant more untouched water, because yes, it is a different definition. It's not that it has to be pure mikvah water, which is by definition has to be mayim chayim. This is more, I probably misspoke in that, giving the wrong impression. It has to be water that has not been used for any other purpose, rather than water that has done other jobs. And then finally, from Mishnah 3, Shimon of Teman says, even if he intended to soak his bread in one water and it fell into another water, the water is valid. So Shimon of Teman has a different standard based upon the kavanah, that we have to go along with the idea that the intention really matters. It appears to be that he is saying that if you accidentally dropped your bread in the water, that it would still be okay. And that if you intended to drop it or put it into water, but you put it into a different water, that the different water would also still be okay. So that seems to be his position. Now he loses the argument, but that seems to be the line that he is going, and he is following a sort of general logic of you have to not only do the act, you have to intend the act. And if you don't have both the act and the intention of the act, then the act is not really a real event, and thus the water would retain its original status and would still be kosher. The rabbis are saying, no, if you did it, you did it, even if it was an accident, and get new water. You'll notice that there there's no discussion here about how difficult it is to get the water or any of the other problems. And that may be partly because we know that the amount of water needed is minute. It is a very, very small amount of water.
Rabbi, can I ask one more question?
Of course.
Back to the living water thing, does that have to do anything with if you get it from the ground and it's undrinkable by an animal, it's valid? But if it's just in a cup and it's undrinkable by an animal, it's invalid?
So it's more to do with like the naturalness of the water, that it is still in its natural state, which appears to be where the rabbis are going with this. So if it has been dyed, if it has been worked, if it has been dunked, or if it is already drawn and now befouled, then it's no longer in its natural state. But the rabbis are not as careful with this water as they are with the mikvah, which is where rightly the term mayim chaim should be used. So this is sort of an in-between category.
And the in-between, is that a leniency created by the rabbis? Since this whole thing is a leniency to begin with, they wanted to preserve some of the things associated with.
One man's leniency is another man's stringency. So, they're more lenient in the sense that they're willing to let water that would not be fit for a mikvah be used for this purification ritual. On the other hand, they are not willing to let water that would be perfectly fine to use for many other purposes to be used for this ritual. So they are lenient with regards, or in comparison to mikvah, but they are stringent with regards to the quality of the water itself.
You're right. And is that like what you were talking about before, to make it easier for people to fulfill the mitzvah, where that one group of people who was constantly going in the mikvah kind of made it hard to fulfill?
That's a good point to raise. Yes, this is them striking, I guess, what you can call a middle ground, which is always a misleading idea because it implies that being right is somehow in between two positions. But it is definitely trying to strike a balance between being overly strict and creating something that is so trivial that it is just unimportant. Natan, I think you have your hand up as well.
Yes, why for the rabbi the Netilat Yadayim is less fundamental, or they're more flexible than the mikveh? Why under the category the mikveh is over the Netilat Yadayim?
Because they made it up. They invented Netilat Yadayim. They did not invent mikvah. Mikvah is part of the Torah itself, at least by the way the rabbis understand it. But they made up Netilat Yadayim. This was invented. And I hate the fact that those words have such a negative feeling in English. There's nothing wrong with the fact that the rabbis, in quote, invented this. The rabbis also invented Hanukkah. That doesn't take anything away from it. The rabbis invented lighting Shabbat candles. That doesn't take anything away from it. But it does mean that they have certainly more flexibility when establishing the parameters, because with mikvah, they are locked into what they believe the Torah is saying. For this, they are definitely coming to a consensus that they have more control over. All right, Mishnah 1:4, again, talking about the quality of the water. If he cleansed vessels with it, with the water, or scrubbed measures with it, the water is invalid. Again, if you do your dishes with this water, it's now wastewater. If you are using it just to pour over your weights and measures to dust them off so that they are officially back to the right measure, again, then it is now wastewater and cannot be used. You can't double dip the water, if you will, with anything other than Netilat Yadayim. If he rinsed with it vessels which had already been rinsed, or new vessels, it is valid. So here the distinction, and Rabbi Yossi declares the water invalid if they were new vessels. So here the question is, did the water do any work? If the things were already rinsed and now you've poured water on them again, does that count as rinsing? And if it does, then the water has been used. Likewise, a new vessel isn't dirty. and therefore putting water through it shouldn't count as anything, and therefore it should be okay. Rabbi Yossi points out that we do usually wash new vessels. We do usually start off by washing them. You bring home a pot from the store, or even one that you make yourself to avoid the issue of immersing new pots in the mikveh. It's still customary for people to wash it before using it. And so Rabbi Yossi thinks that that's good enough to count as work, even if it doesn't need the washing, to render the Netilat Yadayim water as no longer valid. His position does not hold, but I want to go back to that first position about if you rinsed vessels with it which had already been rinsed, that it is still valid. There is a very important underlying logic of that, which is that otherwise you might always have a problem, because any vessel you go to use presumably has been cleaned at some point, and you are now using it to wash your hands with. Well, isn't that rinsing what's been rinsed? And I know what they're talking about here is one level removed of you rinsed vessel A and the water pours into vessel B, and then you wash from the water out of vessel B. But if that weren't valid, then you would have a problem even with using the water from vessel A. So the rabbis are being very logically consistent here in their approach. Part 5 goes back to continues our water questions. Water in which the baker dips his loaves is invalid, but if he moistened his hands in the water, it is valid. So the water that is being used to, again, moisten your baking loaves, that would be wastewater. But if he dips his hands in the water to get them wet and then puts that water on the loaf, that would be fine. That's just borrowing some of the water from the bucket for a perfectly normal use. That isn't putting something in the bucket, which means that the rest of the water in the bucket has now done work. Yes, Aaron.
Is this an attempt to create more of an objective standard versus a subjective standard?
Well, yes. I mean, the rabbis are very loath to leave things as being what we would call purely subjective. They're not going to say, use the water if it looks clean. Use the water if it smells okay. The rabbis are all about giving us very concrete measures that will be able to guide us then of knowing when the water can or can't be used.
Right.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say by subjective, I meant your intent to use it for some work purpose. They want an objective standard of whether it's being used for work purpose versus a subjective standard or an intent standard. That was a differentiation.
Okay. So you mean like, are they trying to make a fixed measure rather than kavanah? That if I think about using the bucket for washing my cat, but then I change my mind and use it for netilat yadayim, is that an important consideration? And the rabbis are saying no, that's not an important consideration. Rabbi Yossi was trying to disagree with that, as we saw earlier, but he loses. Instead, it's only what did you actually do with the water? And yes, that is a much more solid benchmark to keep track of. All right, part 2 is going to get a lot more interesting again. All are fit to pour water over the hands, even a deaf mute, an imbecile, or a minor. All right, deaf mute, imbecile, and minor are people that, as we've talked about before, do not have legal standing within Jewish law and are not generally considered to be able to have a discernible kavanah and an understandable intention for what they are doing. This is not meant to discriminate, persecute, or otherwise harm the people in these categories. It is simply talking about somebody that would be considered to have a legal competency or an identifiable legal competency within an action. What do they actually mean by different things? There are many exceptions. We talked about some of those in our last Masechet in Gittin, and here we are going to talk about one which is trying to point out that the actual pouring doesn't need intention. Yes, we need water that is being poured, not just water that is like, coming out of a pipe. It has to come from a vessel. We know that. But that pouring from the vessel is not important. This is why you can pour on behalf of another person. This is why a deaf mute, an imbecile, or a minor can pour on behalf of another person. Indeed, this is probably closest to what we understand about the Greek ritual that we talked about last week, meaning that certain people of a certain status would have a servant pour water over their hands before they prepare to eat. This was a sign of your status within the society, to have another person to rinse your hands for you within the Greco-Roman world. And here we see that the rabbis are not exactly copying it or aping it, but instead are acknowledging that it is the washing itself that is required. It is not the pouring that is required. So anyone can cause the water to flow from the vessel. That does not require mental competency in order to do it. It doesn't require legal competency to do that, which is why we can go even one step further. A person may place the jug between his knees and pour out the water, or he may turn the jug on its side and pour it out. So if you have a jug that is just too big to use for yourself to try and pour it one hand to the other, you can tilt the jug, either held between your knees or lean it on the edge of the table so that the water will begin to pour out of the vessel. And then you can put your hands under it and do netilat yadayim. So even though there is no real person doing it, from the tilting idea, you cause the flow to happen. So it's not a natural thing. It's not coming out of a pipe, but this is something where there was some agency, but the water is still considered valid despite it not being literally poured by hand at that moment. And once again, to really raise the bar, a monkey may pour water over the hands. If you literally train a monkey, chimpanzee, whatever, to come up and pour water out of a cup onto your hands, that's kosher. It doesn't need any human involvement at all. So you might have thought we needed a human because of the deaf mute, the imbecile, or the child. You might have thought we needed a human because of the tilting or the knees. But no, you don't even need a human. It just has to be something that is causing the vessel to tilt and pour into your hands at this moment. And that could even be a monkey. Rabbi Yossi disagrees. He says that these two cases, meaning the monkey or the tilting, those are invalid. He thinks there does need to be a more direct initiation by a human being to make this considered an actual pouring, as opposed to water that's just moving. He loses the argument, but he does want to draw the line a little higher than monkeys. Questions or comments before we move into chapter 2?
And that goes to show that there's absolutely no kavanah on this, right?
Right. There is no requirement of kavanah for the causing of the pouring. Obviously, you need kavanah to be able to say the bracha, to say the blessing for the netilat yadayim, but you don't need kavanah to commence the flow that you are then using to do the actual washing.
So if you don't say the blessing, is it invalid? I thought that came later on.
So it would still be valid as having done the flowing, but you still need kavanah of why am I putting my hands under this flow? I am doing so to fulfill netilat yadayim. Now, for most of us, the easiest way to establish and clarify that kavanah is through the recitation of the bracha, of the blessing. But yes, technically, if for some reason you couldn't speak, you would still be able to do the deed, even if you didn't say the blessing.
So when it says all can pour, how can all pour if you need kavanah?
No, you don't. That's the point of other people could pour for someone else, the recipient.
Oh, but you have to, the deaf, mute, and imbecile can't be the recipient then.
They would not be because they wouldn't have official kavanah.
Right.
But their kavanah for themselves doesn't need full legal standing to be able to perform the mitzvah that doesn't involve another person. So a deaf mute can still have kavanah if they understand the principle of doing netilat yadayim or eating after having said a blessing or doing kiddush for Shabbat. They can still have the kavanah and perform the mitzvah, even if they can't physically say the blessing. But another person would not be able to borrow their kavanah and say amen because they are not within legal standing of the community. Right? They don't have public legal standing, but they do have personal legal standing.
All right. I thought that was new to modern times where they can communicate better. I thought in the Mishnah times they were deemed to not have kavanah ever.
No, not ever. I mean, like we saw in Gittin, there were times when a deaf mute could be questioned to make sure that what they were saying was in fact, or what they were trying to do was in fact correct with regards to the giving of a get. So that is considered, if they are a reliable mental capacity, they are considered to have kavanah during those moments for some things. But for a lot of other things, you're right. They don't count as having kavanah. It's not a blanket status that the rabbis will talk a deaf mute, a minor, an imbecile, sometimes a slave, sometimes a woman added, depending upon the circumstance. But the reason why they have to keep restating that is because it's not one-to-one, always the same rule for every situation that you might think. Halakha is made up of the exceptions. All right, chapter 2, Mishnah number 1. If he poured water over one of his hands with a single rinsing, his hand became clean. His hand becomes clean. So the person poured water over only one hand, right? Because he's only going to eat with one hand. And he actually does that pouring all in one go. Just push. That 4 rivi'it is there, or at least it was from a vessel with that amount. Then that hand is considered to be pure. If over both hands from a single rinsing, Rabbi Meir declares them to be unclean until he pours a minimum of 1/4 of a log of water over them. So here we're talking about if someone else is pouring water over both hands and you put your hands under it to collect the water as it comes, then there does need to be that rivi'it, that quarter measure, the 3 or 4 ounces that comes out to wash. So that would be sufficient. Now, you'll notice in the commentary that Dr. Kulp is bringing that he brings the other insights from the Gemara and later rabbinic teaching, that if you pour the water twice over each hands, then the hands are considered pure, even if you didn't quite hit the full rivi'it, the full quarter of the log volume of water, as long as there was sufficient water in the vessel itself. So that double rinsing is considered valid. Now, yes, again, we're not looking at the full scientific mechanics of how much water is hitting which part of the body and all of that, although we will talk about the location of the water in a minute. We are talking about what minimum the rabbis established as being sufficient for the cleansing of the hands. Yes, Eric.
How come he doesn't need to wash off the first water? Because isn't the first water supposed to be unclean until he washes it off?
That is the general rule. But here, as you can see, they are setting a very minimum standard that technically it is sufficient for the hand to be considered clean. If you use the right amount of water meaning in the jug, and you poured it on the hand, then it is technically considered to have met the absolute bare minimum of Netilat Yadayim requirements. Yes. Does that work officially mechanically? No, because mechanically we know that the hands create ritual impurity when they're moist because it contacts the hands, blah, blah, or the item, blah, blah, blah. But also it doesn't work if you pour a river over your hands, because the moment the river stops, your hands are ritually impure anyway. So we have to keep coming back to what we talked about a lot last week. If you try to make this fit the normal rules of ritual impurity, it never works. The rabbis are creating their own logic with regards to this particular ritual that bears a resemblance to the rules of ritual impurity by design, but does not follow them precisely. And the way that we practice it today is trying to keep with that spirit. But here in the Mishnah, we are looking at the precise measurements that are needed according to the rabbinic establishment of Netilat Yadayim. And yeah, that's going to create a great deal of dissatisfaction for those of us that would like consistency. And you have to keep remembering the rabbis invented it. They're allowed to change the rules, or not change, they're allowed to set the rules as they see fit. Yes, Natan.
Yes. So if I understood correctly, people don't have to say any bracha because the bracha is a kavanah. As the rabbi created something in order to separate us from the process from the kedusha and everything without any bracha.
Well, so technically, if you didn't say the bracha, you would have still fulfilled the mitzvah, but to deliberately not say a bracha that was established by the rabbis is its own problem. So in the case of a deaf mute who can't say the bracha, they can still perform the ritual. But in the case of you or me, who can absolutely say the bracha, give or take, if we get laryngitis and lose our voice, we are expected to perform this with the bracha, the same way that we should say a bracha for lighting candles or say a bracha for lighting the Hanukkah candles. That these are mitzvot that were established by the rabbis using the authority of Devarim, that the sages are allowed to enact legislation in this way, which the rabbis did very sparingly. They did not do it very much, but that means that we do have an obligation to say the blessing if we are physically capable of doing so.
Thank you.
Okay, and then oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Aaron, I didn't see the hand.
Just out of curiosity, though, since this is day Rabbanan, shouldn't the logic and sense make more than a lot of the day Rotah rules? Because if it's a Hokim, you could say we might not completely understand it. But if it's created by the rabbi, they should fully understand it before creating the rules, though, right?
What's to be misunderstood?
The reason for the reason for differentiating between the separate rules.
You mean why are these things allowed and those things not allowed?
Right, like washing the hands one time and not having to wash off the unclean water.
Because the rabbis are establishing that as the rule. Right. Again, they're not trying to establish a rule to match the precise rules of ritual impurity. They are trying to establish a rule that is similar to the rules of ritual purity, and they are doing so in a way that is definitely confusing, but for them, they feel is the right balance. And they are under no obligation to conform to your or my definition of logically cohesive. For them, this is what they believe is the right way to do it. Now, let's take a little step outside of the Mishnah, and we can ask a bigger question, one that's going to come up later on in this Masechet in a really dramatic way. Are the rabbis actually inventing Netilat Yadayim, or are they refining netilat yadayim. The fact that there is a machloket, that there is a debate between Rabbi Yossi and the Hachamim and other rabbis throughout this Masechet, and also discussed in the Talmud, shows that the rabbis are not starting from zero and sitting around in a committee, making the rules, and then sending out a little pamphlet to everybody. The rabbis seem to be joining a custom that was already known, both within the Greco-Roman world, as well as within the Jewish world, of having a wash before the meal. And they are trying to tame the wild varieties that are out there. They are domesticating it, if you will. They are taking a ritual that was probably quite widespread, but not universal, and they are trying to make it universal and make it consistent. But that means they are going to contend with some of the current practices that are already out there. And some of those practices may have developed organically among the rank and file of the population, and the rabbis are left trying to clean it up. They're left trying to make it all fit in a way that is mostly consistent and logical. And so if we wanted to speak with an academic hat, with a historical hat, the reason why this doesn't make perfect modern computer programming logic sense could also be that the rabbis were doing the best they could with what they had to work with. That people were already washing before meals. The rabbis felt that this was a good ritual, that it had the right elements to protect and save many of the aspects of the concept of truma and of the sacrifices and of the idea of the altar being transformed and transferred to our house. But they needed to clean it up a little bit to add consistency, to make it so that people were doing it in a reliable, dependable, and communal kind of way. So yes, some of its unevenness is probably also attributable to the fact that they did not start from zero with this. They began with an already existing custom and then moved it into position. I'll give you just one more example of that in more modern times. In American Judaism, there is now a very widespread custom of having a ceremony for unveiling, for going to the cemetery and to see the matzeva, the marker that has been placed for the deceased. There are different customs developing around that, especially here in the American community, of do we do it after Shloshim? Do we do it after 30 days? Do we do it immediately after the marker has been finished? Do we do it a year after the marker, after the person passed away? And the consensus is now moving towards doing it at the year mark as being the most common. Now, does that mean you can't do it earlier, can't do it later? Of course you can. This is a very modern custom that has no actual mitzvah attached to it, no halacha that is binding upon it. But we can begin to see how a custom begins to organically grow without anybody saying this is like from the top down, like a mandate from a central court. And we could imagine that if the Sanhedrin got a hold of it now and wanted to harmonize it, to clean it up, they would be setting certain principles and practices, but they would have to contend with the fact that it is not perfectly consistent at the moment. And then they would do their best to make it harmonized and more universally observed. Because right now, not everyone does it. And they would probably want to make sure that it was more universal. But they would probably also make sure that it wasn't too difficult, that it wasn't like you have to, use 5 tons of stone for making the matzeva. So that would be a good example in the modern world of something that is probably similar to how Netilat Yadayim got going. Yes, Eric.
From an academic point of view, though, I've noticed this Mishnah references Greco-Roman culture a lot. Is there anything in the academic world that says this was implemented to prevent Jewish people from engaging or going more towards Greco-Roman culture?
Not that I've read. Anyone can make any argument, but off the top of my head, I would say quite the opposite. That the rabbis were not unwilling to adopt practices that they encountered in the non-Jewish world if they were A, not religious, meaning not attached to idol worship, and B, formed or fulfilled a good function within the Jewish community. And the most famous example of that is the Seder, that this is a pretty clear analog of the Greco-Roman symposium. And they took that and embellished what was already the annual meal for the sacrifice for Pesach into a ritualized retelling and discussion of the Exodus in a way that was so powerful and so good that we still do it today, even though we don't have the sacrifice that was at the heart of it originally. Prusbul also was probably borrowed. Some of the discussion of women's rights and slave rights was probably also borrowed and cleaned up and improved in the Jewish setting. The rabbis were willing. They did not want to borrow it because it came from the Roman world. They did not want to borrow it if it had obvious religious connection, but they were absolutely willing to say, you know what, that's not a bad idea. Let's see what we can do with that. And the same thing has continued on in the modern world. We continue to borrow many aspects from the general society around us, recipes that we keep kosher, melodies that we repurpose for liturgical use, and other insights into how we can administer our communities, run our affairs in ways that are still in keeping with Torah, but benefit from 2,000 years of human insight and creativity. So I think this is actually a good example of how to carefully extract from another society, especially one as dangerous as the Greco-Roman one was to our people back then, something that was good and useful, and make sure that its purpose is ennobled within the Jewish setting.
Right. What was the purpose of the washing of the hands then in the Greco-Roman society? Because it doesn't appear to be anything associated with sanitary.
It doesn't appear to be anything sanitary. It was probably a sign of status, much like the symposium and the reclining that took place at the Seder, that it showed a certain level of where you had reached in the community to be able to have someone else pour the water on your hands for you. That was probably the original form that was most commonly used. And it was a way of showing that you are not eating with dirty fingers because you have the ability to have someone wash it for you, that you can sit down, recline, let someone rinse your fingers and bring you food. Obviously, the Jewish version allows for you to do it for yourself, even though it still talks about others pouring for you. And the Jewish version is not for showing off your elevated status, but instead for trying to remember the holiness that is meant to infuse our lives. All right, and then we're going to continue just the last part here of Mishnah 1 from chapter 2. If a loaf of truma, remember that is the special food that is pure and has to be eaten in purity, that is given as a gift to the Kohanim. If a loaf of truma fell on the water, the loaf is clean. Rabbi Yossi declares it to be unclean. So here again, we're seeing something very, very interesting, very powerful. The water that was just used to rinse your fingers, you would probably think has now become ritually impure. After all, this is not Mayim Chayim. This is not technically water that is being replenished from a natural flowing source. And therefore, if it went over my hands, which were impure, in order to make them pure for the purposes of eating, then surely the water has contracted the impurity of my fingers. That would mean the truma that touches that water would be ritually impure because the water had become impure. No, say the rabbis, the water retains the default position of being ritually pure, even though it has flowed over my hands, flowed, even though it has spilled over my hands. And that means that truma that comes into contact with that particular water is still considered to have its original ritual purity intact. Rabbi Yossi, again, who appears to want to be much stricter with this whole process of netilat yadayim, holds that no, indeed, the water contracts any ritual impurity that's on the hands, and thus it is now considered impure, and that would render the truma impure as well. Questions or comments on 2.1? I don't think we're going to get through 2.2 tonight. No. So we're going to save that for next week because I hate to break Mishnahs in the middle. So
I had a follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead with the follow-up question. We've got a few minutes left since we're not moving on any further.
What happened to that thing that said the first water was impure? Did you just say that even though it's impure, it doesn't contaminate the teruma?
That's what it's saying. And we're going to talk about the first and second water in more detail as we go through the rest of the Masechet. And we're going to talk all about, where the water has to pour and how much it has to cover. And there is a difference here, I guess you could say, between the real purity issues that go along with truma and the simulated purity issues that go along with netilat yadayim. And the simulated impurity issues that are going along with netilat yadayim do not seem to be able to cross over into the real impurity issues of truma. And that is, a good example, again, of one man's leniency as another man's stringency. Rabbi Yossi is trying to be stringent about netilat yadayim and saying, no, real impurity contracts or contaminates truma and makes it impure as well. And the rabbis are saying, if you do that, then you're needlessly, recklessly calling something that is permitted impure. And that means that you are actually stealing from the Kohanim. You are depriving them of what is theirs. They want to be stringent about truma and say, if it is clean, it belongs to the Kohen and you shouldn't take it away. And we're going to protect what the Kohen has as his desserts. Sorry, no pun intended about food topics. But that means we have to be honest that netilat yadayim does not jump that barrier from simulated to real truma and to real tuma impurity, and thus the truma bread is not rendered impure.
So, Rabbi, I know that if something has liquids, it can contract impurities, but can water itself be impure outside of netilat yadayim?
Well, generally speaking, if it has come into contact with something that is absolutely ritually impure, like a body, then the water would be considered impure.
Then how come it? How come the impure water?
Like, take for example, you have an open cup of wine, and the person dies in your tent. To use the classic example, the contents of that cup and the cup become ritually impure. So absolutely, it can become ritually impure. That's why we like to have water for the mikveh that is constantly replenished, what's called mayim chayim, to make sure that hasn't happened. So yes, under some circumstances, water and the other liquids that can transmit the susceptibility to ritual impurity can also become impure themselves. All right, I think that's a great place to stop, and we will pick up with chapter 2, Mishnah 2, and see we're making great progress now. Take care, everyone, and have a wonderful week, and keep studying. Make sure you review.
Rabbi, sorry, one more thing.
Oh, yes?
Thank you so much, Rabbi, for the shiur. Yasher koach.
Hold on, we got one last question. Yes,
is there any way that the reason the teruma remains pure is that the impurity from the water would be a second level impurity, probably, right? Which could not pass impurity?
Again, you're trying to apply the real world laws of impurity to the rabbi's confines of netilat yadayim, and that's never a good recipe. So we'll talk more about impurity next week, but why don't we leave it there for now?